To say the individual endings of the mainline entries in Dangan Ronpa are less than liked is something I don't think is an understatement. Numerous major deductions lead to plot revelations that don't have much time to set in during a climax much larger than the small room everything takes place in. With that, there is leeway to argue that these endings generally don't hold up to the game that came before. It's the eternal struggle the mystery genre finds itself in, but through its high amount of exaggeration, the stumbles of Danganronpa specifically are of note. In previous videos, I argue for the amounts of good to be found over the bad, but things have been taken to a new level with Dangan Ronpa V3. The ending of V3 turned the game on its head quite unlike any other entry in the franchise, while arguably calling some aspects of those very entries into question. And with a series as relatively simple and consumable as Danganronpa, that led to a divided opinion you don't exactly get every day. So in the most literal sense, what the fuck happened? If you feel like you've already got it worked out, skip to the timecode here, or join me as I lay out the game's multi-layered meta-narrative. At the savory centerpiece we have the fictional universe of the Danganronpa franchise, consisting of the first two visual novels, the anime sequel, and various spin-offs. The most important thing to note is that it remains as being distinctly separate. V3's additions to this universe are simultaneously very small yet endlessly vast and deliberately riddled with plot holes. As if the HopeSpeak universe wasn't a clusterfuck anyway. Meaning that unless a later entry expands on the possibility, the HopeSpeak universe remains untouched. V3 doesn't affect this layer of fiction retroactively, but rather builds off of it, the events of the story being written in universe as real fiction, made as entertainment for those in the outermost layer of V3's reality. Though separated here, they do reside in the same space of existence. The best way to think of real fiction is as a mashup of pro wrestling and battle royale. Like wrestling, the flesh and blood characters have their real identities and fictional ones. In a sci-fi twist, they were once fans who wanted to take part in the killing game, and had their memories overwritten so that they now believe themselves to be the fictional characters they portray. However, there is no safety net here. Like in Battle Royale, if they die in the game, they die in real life. Though that's semantic, as to have your personality overwritten is a figurative death in and of itself. The older personality cannot be restored. The outermost layer of reality is a bitter one, and it's one that actively cheers on and enjoys this death, people hunting for fame at the cost of their lives. This grim universe is one we'll come back to, as it's integral to the relationship between the fictional protagonists and the in-game producer Team Danganronpa, the mastermind behind the 53rd season of Danganronpa. Now, where it starts to get a little complicated is in the final trial, where these layers begin to blend as they clash against each other, resulting in a story that is in itself written with multiple layers. At the innermost one you have V3's pure fictional narrative, Danganronpa V3 as the 53rd entry in the franchise. With the meteor set to extinguish all life on Earth, HopeSpeak headmaster Nagi started the Gopher Project to send 16 talented students into space so that they might continue the species, also avoiding a deadly virus carried by the first meteors. All while Super High School of Despair, in classic Death Cult fashion, made an effort to put a stop to humanity's survival. However, as this plot is discovered, the characters deduce its failings. Factual inaccuracies and inconsistencies reveal lies, leading them to discover the fabrication of the flashback light they believed were unlocking past memories, but were in fact giving them new ones. The characters are faced with the artificiality of their existence as they confront their nature as being characters in real fiction. But this discovery was a deliberate reveal. The facts are placed in the game to allow them to reach those deductions, just as the intended solution to overcome this harsh truth was placed in the game. Kibo is not a real person, turned into a fictional HopeSpeak student, but serves as the surrogate to V3's real audience, who collectively vote to guide his actions. When Tsumugi claims that the audience only desires despair and death, Kibo flips that on its head and challenges the idea, leading to the planned climax, which almost immediately stops being as planned as the intended ending is once again challenged, though this time by Shuichi. Team Danganronpa's intended story is put on pause as Shuichi convinces the audience that the long-running Danganronpa should end. The game itself insists you shouldn't play it as it pushes you through minigames you're supposed to give up on, and Shuichi is successful, convincing the audience to stop watching and ending the long-running franchise at last. And this is something a little hard to digest, because through the blind, fervent love of the franchise exemplified in its antagonist Tsumugi, and the criticisms lobbed against it through Shuichi, it challenges anyone who's enjoyed the franchise at the very end of the longest entry in said franchise. With myself being a fan who happens to like the ending, I'm gonna have to say a lot to explain why that's the case. Trust me, that's not a lie. I'm not going to turn around and be all, haha, look, I actually hate the ending. Because I tend to feel that my opinion is somewhere in the minority, so I don't want there to be any ambiguity here. While there has been growing acceptance in the past few months since the release of the game, to simply write off the instances of outright dislike, or even hatred of the ending would be disingenuous. There's a collective confusion about the ending, and it's one I've had to sift through both times I went through the twists and turns of the final trial. But no story starts with the conclusion. Now that we have the full details of the ending on the table, we can better see how the ideas and themes are sprinkled throughout the game before we come back to the final questions, because in classic Danganronpa fashion, its endgame ideas are represented in varying degrees throughout the story, gameplay, and character. I did mention the themes of the game, right? Well, as it turns out, all this meta-babble and multi-layered narratives are in service of truth, lies, and fiction. Fiction being an obfuscation and abstraction of ideas that exists as a lie but still reveals truth, and how even fiction can change the world. Seeking truth is the core of any murder mystery, but V3 mechanically introduces the ideas of lies in its non-stop debates, the most prevalent form of gameplay. When questionable testimony sends the discussion down the wrong path, the guiding character needs to steer things back with a lie. This deceit from the mouth of a protagonist we're supposed to be following is justified with lies being another path to truth, in that through lies being an omission of facts, they may go on to reveal other information, or contain new information in and of themselves. For instance, when Shuichi goes along with Himiko, claiming her illusions are in fact real magic, she gets nervous and is pressed into revealing a part of the illusion that helps alleviate her of suspicion. Not that anyone questions this convenient revelation. This newfound reliance on deceit isn't at the expense of seeking truth, however, as explored in the optional backdoor of the first trial. Shuichi attempts to lie so that he might protect Kaide, the culprit of the current trial. Shuichi's lie is yet another instance of him retreating further into his cowardice, bred by an incident in his backstory where he had a criminal convicted who had only killed out of vengeance for his murdered family. The moral ambiguity of his actions instilled within him a sense of self-doubt at the merits of his supposed talent, and this in turn hinders his skill in detective work during a killing game that so desperately needs that talent. After committing a murder and killing the wrong victim, Kaide isn't going to be around for much longer, so she guides the trial in a way to coax Shuichi out of his shell. The optional backdoor has Shuichi lying to give Kaide an out, risking everyone's lives except hers. It's cowardice. And she further gets this across by contradicting Shuichi's lie, once again forcing him to confront the harsh truth and do what is right rather than what is easy. Through this moment, the game implicitly states that lies should only be in service to larger truths rather than simply being an easy out. Now, while that's the largest offering the gameplay has to the themes, most of the other minigames being retreads of old ground, though the Scrum debate is pretty good, they are also to be found throughout much of the cast in varying degrees. Not simply in that they are themselves lies, being fictional characters, but in the aspects given to these characters to toy with those ideas. Oma, perhaps, exemplifies the idea of lies revealing truth, as the more you engage with him, the more truth you find. On a more simplistic level, Maki's initial lie about being the super high school level child caregiver hinted at the history that led to her becoming the assassin she is. But on the opposite end you have Tenko, whose truths are built on a foundation of lies. Tenko had her dislike of men planted into her by her Neo-Aikido master for her protection, so that she wouldn't be exploited. She's ultimately a good person even if she's heavily misguided. She focuses a lot on others over herself, offering to die in Tojo's place when she's revealed to be the culprit, and most obviously dedicating much of her time to protecting Himiko and trying to get her to push past her laziness. She's even able to open up to Shuichi a little after some prying, coming to the conclusion that men are okay if they practice Neo-Aikido. That's a silly way of putting it, but Tenko is strong as a person in part thanks to Neo-Aikido. She was told that doing rude or obnoxious things like being too excited for Christmas or eating too many sweets would make her lose her strength, while its tenets also call for doing good acts, such as protecting the weak. Being wary of those who might take advantage of you, or taking care to clean your room have nothing to do with fighting. Its teachings are based in those lies, but Neo-Aikido encourages being a good person. So if Tenko can only accept a man who practices Neo-Aikido and thus is in fact good, then that's a fair truth to arrive at even though it's through lies. Iruma's blatant aspects as a character are also centered in a rather interesting lie. She claims she is an augmented human as a result of an accident that left her comatose, and upon waking up she was gifted with her intellectual talent, a talent that has led to her massively inflated ego and pride. Yet while she is boisterous, even the slightest form of resistance to her greatness has her tucking her tail in between her legs. Since her pride is based on an incident that nearly killed her, that pride is just as fragile as her body. Her persona as the inventor that humanity needs and the enhanced human malarkey are both forced facades, lies she's too dumb to even realize herself. In a way it goes against the theme of the game because the harsh truth is never confronted, but she's not quite the only one. Himiko has a running gag where she claims her magic is in fact real, which is tied to a history with her teacher, a performer who Himiko surpassed and upstaged unintentionally. She rationalizes the abandonment through a series of lies, but while in some way she is running from the truth, she also hopes that through continuing her trade she will be able to meet her master again and confront that truth at last. In running from what he believes to be a harsh truth, Ryoma lives the lie that he has no interest in tennis. In avoiding it, he hoped to run from his painful past, but Shuichi convinces him to challenge and overcome that lie, giving at least some closure where the previous examples had the ideas brought up through their characters unexplored. Because, you know. As for another lie that goes unchallenged, there's Anji's. Her set of religious beliefs and codes doesn't actually relate to her religion, but acts as an extension of herself and her desires, as exemplified when she sends her first convert, Himiko, out to the wolves in the class trial as soon as she even remotely becomes an inconvenience. Also, God's not real, so he's a lie, he's fiction. A number of characters I've yet to mention, however, base themselves in the other faucet of lies central to the story. Korekiyo and Tsumugi have their talents based in fiction, Tsumugi having her success in the love other people have for the characters she portrays, while she also has a deep love of various fictions herself, showing how those fictions influence the world. Korekiyo's studies lean on myth and folklore, stories that tell truth of shared human experiences across cultures and serve as shared stories to be referenced and called upon in contemporary works. Kibo, on the subject of his rather negligible talent, confers with Shuichi on becoming something of a robot idol to help give his kind more approval in society, even asking for help on his backstory, effectively creating a fictional character to act as a stage presence that idols often do. Goto's lie is weird. It turns out he was actually raised by reptites and lived Street Fighter, but his original story of being raised by wolves, shared to protect his jungle family from investigation, is a lie hinging on a trope that others would recognize and accept even though it's not really any less weird. His understanding of some aspects of fiction also factor into his core motivation of becoming a gentleman. What it means to be a gentleman is something he defines with another series of references, such as to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure or Professor Layton. But these references are in service of the gentleman concept that largely exists in the past unless referenced in a contemporary piece of fiction. And perhaps the most unusual connection to fiction is in Kaito, who tells his backstory in the form of imaginary stories and games of pretend he came up with as a child. He presents them in a way that can't be taken at face value, but Kaito, ever the dummy, tells them with a level of sincerity that has Shuichi baffled. And that sincerity for falsehoods is hugely important, because Kaito is just as much of a faker as Oma. Outside of his backstory, he never has a meaningful success on screen despite his bluster, typically fucking up or riding on the coattails of Kaide or Shuichi. His greatest on-screen victory is when he dies before Monokuma can get him. Even though his pride is formed by lies of his greatness, it's still something that allows Shuichi and Maki to believe in him. So in his blunt honesty, Kaito exemplifies the idea that a fiction can change something even without the meta-narrative that idea was in service to. And speaking of Shuichi, we'll be coming back to him later. For now, I'll wrap up with Kaide and the unfortunate exceptions, Rantaro and Tojo. Kaide doesn't have much else other than her existence as a fictional character affecting Shuichi, also true of Kaito and Tenko, unless you give it a stretch to include the meta lie of her as a main character, but that's a bit flimsy. In furthering flimsiness is the idea of stretching out Rantaro and Tojo's secretive positions as a super high school level survivor and Prime Minister of Japan out to be lies, because that's not an omission of truth. Not necessarily. A secret is an avoidance of truth, intentional or not, but in the case of their roles in the story, they don't have the answer to the question, so they can't truly lie. Their secrets may have been why the writers didn't give them any deeper truth or lies, which is mildly disappointing. I will note that while Tojo does have references in her free times, such as to the legend of Koizumi, Goto's references are influencers to his worldview, showing how he has been affected and bettered by fiction, but Tojo's only served to show off her talent, rather than to transform or meaningfully add to her character. However, simply because not everyone fits the mold perfectly doesn't mean that it was an accident that so many characters touch on the core themes of the game. That's standard of the series, as I addressed the same idea in my previous videos on the first two games, because V3 is a Dangan Ronpa game, new Dangan Ronpa in the original title, which is why what I find fascinating is how it twists elements from these older games and arguably does some of them even better in even the most minor of ways. And how do you get more minor than the Monokuma Theater? In the first two games, they served as small bits of characterization for the ever-present antagonist, the time spent reading used to help along the illusion of passing time between night and day. They serve an identical role here, but a slight alteration turns it into a cute little pun. Rather than the simple, minorly changing background, you get full CGs of references to Western films. But remember, CGs denote some level of significance, and the movies shown are important, which in turn reflects the theme of the game. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was censored and banned in several parts of the world, striking up debates about censorship when ironically it does more with what it doesn't show than with what it does. The Matrix brought ideas of solipsism and simulated realities to a larger part of the public conscience. They are just a few of the well-known fictions that in some ways, however small, changed the world. And in changing its world, it further adds a new take on the memory alteration and the television broadcast. Whereas the memory alteration was more of a plot necessity in both visual novels, and an extra source of tension in the second game, it's integral to the story of V3 in a bigger way, where memory is taken to the logical conclusion, whole characters being changed entirely between two versions of the prologue scene, with differences as major as Kaide's mildly awkward music references, to as small as how Tsumugi screams in terror at the appearance of the Exisal. The broadcast is of course the reason V3 is happening at all. While in the first game it was an important, though not quite vital aspect to the climax, in the second it was just a way to get some returning characters to show up for the finale, and overall not so important beyond that, making it feel more obligatory. And I don't want V3's usage of these elements that have been present since the beginning to be overlooked. There's a sense of obligation that seems to come with so many sequels, especially in visual novels, or at least the ones I've played. Patterns that don't really need to be there but are cute to notice. These are fine when small, but when they detract from the story it becomes an issue. As I mentioned in my Dangan Ronpa 3 video, the story having 16 involved characters is normal, but with Dangan Ronpa 3 in particular, the story suffered for its bloated cast, with many of the characters being unnecessary and taking up screen time from the characters who actually mattered, arguably. However, a rare sentiment I've seen thrown around hinges on the memory loss, arguing that the characters aren't worth discussing as they aren't even real within its own context. But I don't agree with that line of thought. To put aside that fiction influences reality, justifying the discussion in the first place, other ideas from the same vein are touched upon well before the finale, specifically when it comes to the worth of their lives in the first place. If the characters can't be valued for discussion because they're fictional, then what about the shifting value they place on their own lives even before that point? The second trial puts Ryoma, a man with no value in his own life on account of losing everything, against Tojo, whose status as a Prime Minister of Japan potentially places her life as being more valuable than any of those within the killing game, something a few characters even agree with. And even more drastically, there is the crushing discovery of humanity's supposed extinction. The characters are pushed time and time again by their relation with the world they remain separate from. First a world that may suffer for their actions, then one they cannot go back to, then one that seems to enjoy their suffering. With the meaning of their lives being challenged again and again, they are forced to find the value in their existence. To take meaning from a situation of meaninglessness, even if they need to die to force a change in the status quo. It's more of a motif than a theme, but still plants the ideas explored in the climax much earlier in the story indirectly. The difference is not so great, even if the solution to these rather difficult issues aren't exactly delivered in the most satisfying way. I can forgive the primary function of the fictional characters in Kaito, Kaide, and Tenko acting as inspiration to drive them through the climax. It strikes some similarities to the likes of Naegi being touched by Sayaka's last-minute attempt to clear his name after framing him, or Asahina pushing herself forward through Ogami's sacrifice, or Hinata receiving Nanami's support, so it's another old idea being recontextualized for the new themes. Even if it's less transformative, I still think it works, so I don't mind it being used again here. What I don't think works is how the group overcomes the supposed death of their home planet. The mastermind makes another flashback light, giving everyone some fresh context. So now, instead of thinking that they are the last of humanity sent on a vessel by a good organization to escape an evil one that wormed their machinations onto the project anyway, they find out that they are the last of humanity sent out on a vessel by a good organization to escape an evil one who wormed their machinations in anyway. All the flashback light accomplishes in the moment is applying names to those organizations that fans of the franchise would recognize. Hope's Peak, Headmaster Naegi, Super High School of Despair, Junko. Nothing about the situation has actually changed, yet in moments, everyone goes from lethargically unable to do anything but contemplate suicide, to better stop that mastermind, because, you know, hope. It's shallow, and I think that might be the point. It's accompanied with a triumphant surge of the original opening rather than a jazzy remix for V3, making it an incredibly blatant fanservice moment. And to look both backward and ahead, this isn't quite a retread of old ground. The last two visual novels, and even Ultra Despair Girls, reserved the theme for the ultimate triumph over the main antagonist. Yet here, there is no triumph to accompany the music, just the promise of one to come later. Where my belief that it's intentionally hollow stems from the fact that it's undercut not once, but twice. First, the plan they come up with to rescue Kaito fails as a murder occurs, turning their rescue mission into a return to the killing game. And secondly, in the final trial, the hope they place in the fictional academy is pulled out beneath them when Tsumugi reveals it as fiction, the moment accompanied by the opening theme once again. The triumph is twisted out of Shuichi's hands and into Tsumugi's, turning the usage of the theme into something much more sinister and chilling despite there being no actual change to the music itself. And it's worth mentioning that the theme does not return when Shuichi once again turns the trial back to his favor. I think it works really well, though not enough to excuse how hollow the first moment is, but it does bring me to those questions I've been dodging around. Does V3 throw out what makes it Dangan Ronpa? Does it in turn want to deride you as a fan for daring to enjoy it? That's honestly the most challenging idea the game presents, because it gets across the question through some rather speedy character beats in a short time frame thanks to the huge amount of information delivered in the climax, while also getting the mechanisms for answering across in a way that really does seem like it's challenging you as the player. The characters take hollow references to past games as a means to look forward, only for them to be dashed as they find out what inspired them was just another piece of fiction. If this was meant to be taken as criticism of those empty labels, hope and despair, then there's a similar criticism of those ideas at the start of the Chapter 6 investigation. While trying to convince Kibo, who attempts to destroy the academy because he feels that hope is gone and despair can't be allowed to remain, Shuichi says that those still alive represent the hope that they should cling on to, but Kibo rebukes the idea, So Shuichi then goes on to say that hope is in fact the possibility of there being an audience watching the killing game, contradicting the preconception and memories they have of humanity's extinction. It works to convince Kibo, but that's kinda bullshit. The problems with the words hope and despair across the franchise have a number of issues, but when it comes to isolated ideas and moments, there was a higher level of consistency to be had. Naigi's hope in the climax of the first game is the will to be optimistic and self-confidence in the face of anything, while Komaeda sees it as an absolute good meant to be cultivated and triumph over any evil. Thanks to all these varying definitions, when actually looking at the story and character, it makes more sense when you throw out the word and focus on what's being said or done. And that's also the problem. Hope means one thing, and another, which defeats the point of tying it all to one word. When hope comes up in Ultra Despair Girls, it's usually used to refer to something good, and it often occurs for the sake of having that hope twist into a despair, which is just to say it's now something bad. Yuta shows up to help them escape before dying to show off the helplessness of the situation. Fukawa bumps into Komaru and joins her, but was actually working with Komaeda the whole time. The Warriors of Hope think they're doing the right thing and killing adults who hold power over children, but Monaco was merely wielding their determination and drive as part of their role as pawns in her own game with their own goal. So when the ending goes on about not resolving in any form of hope or despair, that flies in the face of the final boss being defeated by a big old hope bullet. If Komaru and Fukawa's friendship is supposed to be a hope, then did it come from the despair of them having to work together throughout the game? Was it really that bad? Or is the motif not supposed to be taken in this moment because the rest of the ending tries to avoid hope and despair deliberately? By trying to do so much with one word, the whole point of using one word is completely and utterly lost. If this moment with Shuichi's shifting definitions happened in any other entry in the franchise, I would chalk it up to the same tired, annoying issue. But this is in the course of a single conversation. A conversation taking place in the one game of the franchise that later throws out that amorphous hope along with the despair. Shuichi putting all his faith into that hope is dashed when the truth comes out, so as to fall back on not hope, despair, or future, but instead turns to lies, fiction, and the truths they hold. However, in throwing out that hope, a word closely tied to the primary entry in the franchise, the question remains regarding what is lost in the process. The finale tears down so much, such as when Shuichi calls Tsumugi's stories sick and twisted when she's a member of the team that wrote Dangan Ronpa V3. You know, the sick and twisted game you played. Or when he says people enjoying the senseless suffering and murder he had to go through for their entertainment is wrong. His words are totally justified in the context of the universe. His world is one where a battle royale style game is widely viewed, celebrated, and enjoyed at the cost of actual lives. The glimpses of the cast we see before their transformation into the characters they are now isn't pleasant. Shuichi eagerly describes his ideas for a scenario involving his detective character as a culprit, a situation that would have him kill someone before his own death. Kaede says she wants in because she doesn't have any faith in humanity, while Kaito just wants fame and fortune regardless of what his character has to do for him to get it. This is the area where the head writer, Kodaka, points to, insisting that the fictional audience and the real-world audience are separate. But I feel as though this response is dismissive, disregarding the obvious meta-implications aimed at the actual audience that needs to actively not play the minigames in the final trial when Shuichi gives up on the game. Even if it wasn't intentional, parts of the audience still take the comment as though it were being aimed at them, and dismissing the question through artistic intent doesn't excuse that the game will persist well beyond the point when that outside explanation of intent is lost. The last shot of the epilogue is of Shuichi looking through the glass dome in a way that makes it look as though your own screen is broken. I don't blame anyone for taking it this way. So to address the issue by similarly killing the author, I'll use the ending itself in response. The amount of control offered through the gameplay is part of what makes it more personal, as it forces the player to be active in the story. This also happens throughout with the voting, but whereas in previous games the voting was done automatically, V3 gives you more control. While who you vote for changes nothing and is never commented upon, you must vote to proceed. That is until the end, where you aren't. Progress is achieved by dismissing the rules and not exercising the control you've been given. It's paradoxical. Control is given to the player for ineffectual reasons at first, then for the player to deliberately avoid using in the end. The rules say to pass the minigame, but you win by not playing. The rules say to vote, but you win by not voting. It's a clear pattern, and I'm phrasing the shift in gameplay goals moving beyond the confines of the game as rules for a purpose. The same purpose one might expect from the genre. The same purpose that hinges on my response to the question of V3's stance on the rest of Dangan Ronpa and the fans that enjoy it. Dangan Ronpa is a death game story, and a key element to such stories is the idea of subverting rules and systems put in place by an authority. In a well-known example, Battle Royale has a class of students forced to kill each other by the government until one is left standing, but the authority is overcome and escaped with two running from the game with their lives intact, not one. This core idea of rebelling against authority fits the teenage demographic of Dangan Ronpa like a glove. In the first game, Junko usurps the authority of Hope's Peak herself, taking control of the last bastion in a ruined world. but after demanding one student graduate through killing, she is defeated and 6 graduate without shedding blood. In Super Dangan Ronpa 2, she once again usurps authority, forcing the cast to choose between staying in the virtual reality or gaining their freedom, but they instead choose a third option that again subverts her authority. V3 is no different, with Tsumugi standing in for Team Danganronpa, the authority that controls even the foundations of the characters forced to go through the game, and that's important. Junko isn't the mastermind. The Hope Robot Kibo and the Despair Mastermind Tsumugi die in the final cutscene right before the credits. Danganronpa V3 doesn't just break the rules of authority. Through the meta-narrative, V3 breaks the rules of Danganronpa. And that's half of where I believe the contention around the ending lies. If you take the breaking of rules as a dismissal of everything Danganronpa, then as a fan, you have every right to be angry. But we're not done talking about Shuichi and his role in the story, because Shuichi is Naegi, or rather, he's an echo of him like Tsumugi is of Junko, what with her multiple personalities and all. He's a sidekick with limited skill in detective work, and his character beats follow a similar path ending on a similar conclusion, but with a stronger execution. Both go through arcs of self-confidence, but Naegi starts out with his confidence largely in place. It's then challenged repeatedly throughout the game. Sayaka's betrayal shakes it, and Kirigiri pushing him to solve the murder keeps him from blindly defending her, meaning he also can't be blindly optimistic. The murders instigated by Owada and Celes don't add much to the conversation, but when Ogami is ostracized, Naigi's optimism slowly pulls the group back together. His trust then challenged when he sticks his neck out for Kirigiri in the 5th trial. Through having his optimism challenged and surviving, reaffirming his confidence, he's able to pull his friends out of the rut Junko dug them in, surpassing her and allowing them to leave with their heads held high. Shuichi's path, however, is much more tumultuous and challenging. He starts out with almost no confidence, possessing a talent he never really exemplified nor believed in. Kaede, recognizing the usefulness of said talent in a situation that so obviously demands it, makes the most of her mistake in killing Rantaro to push him out of his comfort zone, encouraging him to both end the killing game, and to do so by uncovering the truth, no matter what lies he has to use to find that truth and no matter how harsh that truth actually is. Tojo's murder then put Shuichi in another situation of doubt. Like the murderer he had arrested in his backstory, Tojo's crime also has a moral ambiguity in her conviction, with the victim having willingly gone through with it. Without Kaede to give Shuichi the confidence he needs, it's Kaito who steps up to the plate and helps Shuichi move past his doubts. Korekiyo's murder drops the moral ambiguity, but also drops Shuichi's moral support, as Kaito is far less able to help due to personal fears, forcing him to work with the less than encouraging Maki. The 4th murder then more strongly challenges Shuichi with a harsher truth. The whole trial, Oma is the more suspicious one by far, and considering his devil-may-care attitude and tendency to treat everything like it's a joke, it's easy to see why the group may even want him to be the culprit. But in seeking the truth, it comes out that the far more lovable Gonta is at fault, though even he's not aware of that truth. It's too hard a pill for Kaito to swallow, forcing Shuichi to surpass his driving outside force. Said force then teams up with the conniving Oma by becoming a murderer in an attempt to end the killing game by ousting Monokuma as fraudulent, but Shuichi defeats their viable plan, coming to yet another conclusion with dubious levels of triumph. But by this point, Shuichi has truly come into his own, with Kaito supporting his decision in the end even if it means continuing the game. And the finale takes the foundation he built his beliefs on, Kaede and Kaito, and removes them from the equation by revealing their existences as fictional, forcing Shuichi to either recontextualize his beliefs or abandon them and the faulty premises they rest on, choosing the former as the option that leads him to surpass Team Danganronpa and convince the world to end the game. And the final point of the ending similarly evokes the epilogue of the first game. The living characters must take their reaffirmed beliefs into a world that they don't know the shape of. They believe that the world may have changed through the killing game, but it's unclear. I'm not satisfied with that vagueness in either game. It only serves to risk taking away the meaning left by previous events, in both cases, adding nothing. But beyond the vagueness, this epilogue is in service of something else. Shuichi believed that sacrificing everyone's lives was the only way to beat Tsumugi, yet the audience still chose to spare their lives in the end, the lives of fictional characters. No longer is the story a senseless game for the entertainment of others at their expense, because it already made a tangible change in the world, one that spared lives that were willing to sacrifice themselves to make that change. He even likens the killing game to a tragedy during the trial, something that perhaps shouldn't have happened, yet should still be remembered as a cautionary tale. Death is something to take meaning from, and a narrative that doesn't say anything through its death is exactly the senseless killing he refutes. And that's important to what I think the game is trying to accomplish, what the games have always been trying to accomplish. The first 2 games play into cultural context regarding graduation to implicitly offer support to those leaving the relative safety of high school into the vast and potentially frightening, unpredictable world beyond. Through the deaths of fictional characters, the games intend for you to take something from them. They have always been attempting to inspire some form of change in the real world. And with such a blatant ending, what I think is getting overlooked here is that Danganronpa V3 may be throwing out the rules of Danganronpa, but through keeping its focus on maintaining self-confidence in the face of anything while breaking the rules of authority in hopes of bringing some change to reality, it still very much holds on to the spirit of Danganronpa, Hope, despair, and Junko are not being picked apart, but brought up and discarded in service of an ending that still preserves the emotional core. And that's what really matters. If it wanted to throw out that spirit as well, then there would be no reason to keep everyone alive so that they can continue to face forward. The ending doesn't need hope, or despair, or Junko, or the opening theme playing at the right moment, or even the name Dangan Ronpa, as long as it has that core spirit. And in that, I think V3 is more than a welcome entry in the franchise and the genre. It's a strong ending, and one that represents a unique take on the death game story that can only be done in an established franchise. A tweet from the head writer, Kodaka, that's getting posted out of context reads in English, Dangan Ronpa V3 has no end, and it's often brought up to claim that the end of the game is being contradicted. But often left out is another tweet where he states something evoking part of the last lines from the game, that a story doesn't end, but is carried on through those who have received it. Match this with Shuichi's last lines in the game, which carried the same sentiment in messages published by the staff well before this tweet, where he says, "If this lie was able to change even the smallest thing, then the story isn't over." And that's self-fulfilling. All fiction, all art that has some effect on a person, by nature affects the world in small ways. The references sprinkled throughout the franchise are examples of works that have affected both developers and localization team alike. If you just spent a half an hour watching this video because you played the game and wanted more discussion, then perhaps your world was changed in a small way. And I can say with certainty that this ending resonates with me because Danganronpa has affected me creatively in ways no other works of fiction really have. And as this is the third entry in the third trilogy of works I've made relating to Danganronpa, that's no lie. On the notion of spirit, I want to talk about the confirmation of an upcoming Danganronpa game and what I think about the future of the franchise. Because as someone who loves these games, I would honestly be perfectly fine if there was never another entry in the Danganronpa franchise. The spin-offs are meh at best, and at worst, they're more like... But what I want is one thing, and reality is another. V3's conclusive ending can easily be taken as the end of Kodaka's involvement in the franchise. He said in tweets and interviews that Danganronpa V3 was the best Danganronpa game he could make, and that he's interested in seeing what others can do with the franchise, while he's looking to try his hand at something else. The Hope's Peak universe is kind of a clusterfuck, and any continuation to V3 would risk defeating the point. So I think I'm with Kodaka on this one. I'm curious as to what he'll be up to next. I'm curious as to what future entries with or without him will look like, and I'm curious as to if Danganronpa's popularity will affect the landscape. I have no idea how I'll feel about Danganronpa V3 and the rest of the franchise 5 or even 10 years from now, but with a cautious level of optimism, I'll be waiting to see how this little piece of fiction might go on to change the world, in whatever small way it shall. This video was brought to you by my patrons such as Peter Carnes, Volkyan, and MathWiz. If this video has affected your world in some small way, perhaps consider lending me some support. If you're afraid of long-term commitment through Patreon, and I don't blame you, you can try Ko-fi for a one-time donation. However you choose to support me means a lot because I would be nowhere without my viewers, so all forms of support are muchly appreciated. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.